Okay, right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Pepper. I'm a director of the TMA. Today's webinar is an event which we do on a regular basis. We try and form a view of what's interesting for our members over the kind of the insolvency restructuring landscape. Previous webinars have been on property, and this one is on aviation. Today, I'll go through a bit of housekeeping to start with, and then I'll hand over to the panelists in about a couple of minutes. Today's presentation is sponsored by Quantoma, and effectively with our partners such as John Pye, who is a corporate partner, we're bringing together this action to you. We have 256 registrations today. We're building up nicely. We've still got about 50 left on those, but I'm sure they'll join once their coffees have probably been made. My name is Andrew Pepper. I'm, as I said, TMA director. I've been the chair of the TMA. I'm an insolvency practitioner, turnaround specialist, chairman NED. And I also own a couple of businesses that are affected by today's issues in aviation. One is a travel agency business, and one is a corporate taxi, a chauffeur-driven business. So it'd be really interesting to see what these guys are going to do to help me understand a bit more about the future in aviation. As I said, the TMA is a large organization. We would love you to join if you're on this for the first time. If you're an existing member, we'd also love you to be more active, both regionally, corporately, and locally. We run a whole set of seminars during the year. In the past, it's been physical seminars, but we've had great success on the webinars and Zoom calls. As you can see, we have a number of key sponsors. These people, if you look through in detail, are players within the restructuring insolvency community. And often they are sponsoring or doing keynote speeches for us. I'd like to say thank you again to our corporate partner sponsor, John Pye. And they've been a very, very strong sponsor of the business for the last 2 years. We would encourage anyone else who wants to come in and help us with sponsorship to contact me or our secretariat on the website. Moving on, our two guest speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Peter Davis, who is a very, very experienced aviation guy who has chaired, CEO'd, commentated. He's a robust guy. We've had some little conversations before this meeting, and I think this could be a very, very interesting 40 minutes. We also have Paul from Quantoma, who is an aviation specialist when it comes to restructuring. Paul has got heavily involved in a number of aviation and aviation-related issues, so he'll be able to give some experience and some little war stories on that. The aim of our presentation is to talk about aviation per se. We're looking at regional airports, regional players. We'll touch upon the latest Virgin issue, but ultimately this is all about what can we do to help the people, our audience, understand a bit more about what's going on in aviation, how to work with clients that may need help who are based in aviation, and maybe also the guys that work second or third hand into aviation, the suppliers, the people who are actually doing various pieces of work for those guys. So it's going to be an all-encompassing 45 minutes. We'll do 10, 15 minutes at the end for conversation and questions, and we'll try and get it all finished, wrapped up by about 10:30, 10:35. So without much more ado, I'll hand over to Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and hello everyone. Well, it's a great opportunity to be able to outline some of the issues of the aviation industry. Much has been said and reported on, but I suppose my primary concern is that pre-COVID-19, the aviation industry is not blessed with making lots of money. It's got a very poor track record in terms of shareholder return. There's obviously a notable few that we hear about, but generally most airlines around the world are pretty poor investments. I think something like IATA produced a statistic in 2019 which suggested that only about 14 airlines globally produced in excess of 60% of the total profits. And what's happened since then, COVID-19 has actually exacerbated that situation, clearly, to the point that most airlines have now got to completely restructure themselves. The issue I have is if those airlines were poor performers before COVID-19. What's going to change significantly to allow them to become better performers once we get down to a level of normality, whenever that happens to be? No crystal ball, but certainly people suggest that it's not going to be until 2024 before any level of return to the previous numbers of passengers we saw flying before. Clearly, short haul is reacting quite strongly at the present moment, and certainly there are reports of a number of airlines, aircraft flights being full. But you have to bear in mind that the percentage of those flights in comparison to this time last year, around about 25–30% of what was flying. So let's not get carried away with a lot of people going back to flying. And certainly from my experiences, in terms of people who are speaking to me, the airports are pretty quiet. So it's going to take a long time for that to recover. However, as a CEO of many airlines, one has to be optimistic, and I think this is a great opportunity for airlines to reset their dials. The key is, can they get through the short-term liquidity issues? We're not very good at that, and certainly a lot of airlines have been building up their balance sheets by way of equity or debt. My key question, therefore, is how they're going to pay for that in the long term, given the fact that they haven't been particularly prolific in producing funds for their shareholders in the past, or indeed taxpayers if they're government-owned airlines. So I think there's a significant quandary at the present moment in terms of what will the size and shape of the airline industry look in the future. Certainly with the larger aircraft, you heard the British Airways announcement, 747s, I think Virgin are following following likewise, and other airlines have taken capacity out of the market. So I think once long haul returns, short term, there may be some benefits, because hopefully those airlines have readjusted their cost base. So really concentrating on making sure they get the lowest possible cost delivered to the customer, put them in a good position. But I still question whether long term there is an opportunity for them to come back to a level of profitability. The last point I would make at this stage is that I've always been concerned, and having been involved in a number of turnarounds, that one single common theme about that is not so much the market that these airlines are operating in, but more the management, particularly middle management, that's been responsible for handling the situation. And often I find the strategic conduit that they introduce can be used maliciously or not in the correct way. And therefore it's potential that if middle management continue in the same way that they were allowed to continue pre-COVID, then I see it quite difficult for many airlines to recover their lost position. So if I was a shareholder or a board, then certainly significant restructuring, significant change, not just from a financial perspective, that's obvious, in terms of restructuring and improving the balance sheet, but really the mentality and the way in which the airlines have tackled their industry and their businesses in the past, and how that's going to change in the future, because it absolutely has to for them to survive. Over to you, Andrew. Hello.
Paul, I think we've lost Paul. Just a second. Unfortunately, Paul is stuck in France at the moment, and he was saying earlier that his signal isn't necessarily brilliant. So I think, Peter, if we could just explore a little bit more, potentially, I know Paul will want to talk about Virgin, and also will want to talk a bit about the passenger transport tax. Shall we just have a quick chat about what's happened? It came out in the press yesterday that the various airlines are wanting to waive 12 months worth of tax. That sounds quite a good idea from the point of view of getting more bums on seats. But would you have a different view of where that extra value will go to?
Well, I think if I was head of revenue management or still a CEO of an airline, then certainly I would be making sure that of much of that reduction by way of the ADP was kept within the revenue and not given back to the customer. That sounds a rather churlish, but yeah, this is a dog-eat-dog business, and we're trying to maximise our revenue. I've referred to the fact that we're not consistent in making good profits. Our margins are normally very low, and therefore any opportunity, particularly at this stage, and certainly from a cash point of view, then I'd be endeavouring to make sure that we were able to still be very competitive with our prices. But I suspect the airlines would want to retain as much of that ADP with their own revenue structure rather than hand it on to the passenger.
Yeah, that's probably a similar issue that's coming out through the restaurant business as well, with the VAT decrease as well. So these things might actually on paper be very good for increasing volume, but it actually might just be a straight little cash grab. And it's, to a certain extent, it's probably a bit like the furlough system where people were paying gross versus net on looking after the employees. If you look back on the last, say, 3 recessions that you've seen, and going back to when you were practically in charge of Malta or other businesses, are you seeing any real differences between the problems you're getting today because of COVID versus perhaps some of the problems that you've seen in the past through other types of recessionary issues?
No, I think this is unprecedented. I mean, we've had the SARS and we've had obviously 9/11 and those other issues which have had a global impact. But the length of those were recovered quickly. I was living in the States during 9/11 and obviously you couldn't fly for 3 or 4 days, but certainly within, if I remember, within 10 days or 2 weeks, those aircraft were full again. So the situation clearly is completely different here. So this is absolutely unprecedented. It's difficult to see how many airlines will survive. Some have already gone bust, others will follow. It comes back to the simple facts of how can you shore up your balance sheet to keep yourself going in the short term, liquidity, but at what cost does that come? What are the consequences in 2 or 3 years' time if your debt or the servicing of that debt has gone up appreciably, which seemingly it has. So yeah, I'm not optimistic in terms of airlines being able to survive, or as many airlines being able to survive. What I am optimistic about, if I was a CEO, not that I'll be rubbing my hands at the present moment, but certainly I'll be looking at the opportunities in terms of, okay, how can we take advantage of this situation by reducing capacity, looking at new types of equipment, more effective, efficient equipment, and get ourselves into the marketplace based on our brand.
But capacity is one thing, but I've got some friends at the Gatwick Airport and they were saying the scheduled flights they're thinking of, which will take off last week, today, next week, are something like 10% of the normal. And they can't see how that volume dramatically increases. Have you got any inside track on what sort of level of volume of takeoffs or landings you're seeing at, say Gatwick or another regional airport, to give the audience a feel for what's the truth behind the volumes?
Well, if you look at we monitor the amount of fleet that's flying per airline, certainly within Europe, and at the moment, as an average, on short haul, it's around about 25 to 30%. So a long way short, and here we are at the height of summer, so that's not going to, perhaps August may see an increase in that, but obviously that would tail off as we get into the autumn period. We've always said that this will be consumer-led in terms of the recovery, clearly, subject to the environment being created by the airlines to make sure those people can be attracted. But, and that depends on government restrictions and regulations. I've been speaking to pals who are arriving in the UK without any foreknotice in terms of the 4-page questionnaire that you have to fill in, which seems to take an earth to get through the airport. So there's a lot of bureaucracy that needs to be cleared up, and obviously the potential for a vaccine could make significant difference. So until those things are resolved, and even then it's guesswork after that to a certain extent. But certainly I think that the recovery is going to be slow. Because on the airports, this is a huge impact, because it's not just what we call the aeronautical income from landing fees and parking, etc., but it's huge knock-on effects in terms of the average airport. Something like at least 50% of their total revenue, as an average, comes from non-aeronautical, obviously passenger related. So car parking, retail consortium, all sorts of things. And the footfall is clearly 70, 80% down on what it is. So airports are feeling significant pain at the present moment, along with everyone else. It's not a good industry to be in at the moment.
Right, our man from France has got back on. His cottage Wi-Fi is now working, I understand. So Paul, we've basically had a quick chat, a robust conversation about what's happening in a bit of general. We might touch on a few points that you want to raise, but the floor is yours.
So the observant amongst you will have noticed, obviously, that I dropped out there, and I did that on purpose. That wasn't just anything to do with the fact that I'm trying to hotspot off a 4G signal, which then went down to 3G and then disappeared. I did it in order to sort of illustrate the fact that using platforms like this, it's all very well, but actually sometimes you do need to get together physically, and to do so you need to fly. So hopefully we've all sort of seen that live and seen the implications of all of our technology not working properly. I'm a restructuring and insolvency practitioner. So I don't want to sort of sound glib, but this particular period period of time has been probably the most... Am I unstable again? Sorry. Andrew, I've turned off my video, so nod if you can hear me.
Yeah, that's fine. We can hear you. So I'll crack on with the voice.
Yeah, so from an academic perspective, this is sort of a fascinating period in many respects, because people like to talk about the new normal, and they like to talk about this being unprecedented. Well, yes and no. I mean, clearly we've never been in exactly this situation before, but actually lots of the sort of macroeconomic and the business consequences of coronavirus, we have sort of experienced similar situations before, and we do have some lessons from the past that we can build upon. And it's those lessons that we sort of look to as restructuring and insolvency professionals when we're sort of considering the rebuild, the restructure of industries, including, in this instance, the airline industry. And I was having an interesting conversation yesterday with a journalist who is sort of following the Virgin Atlantic story and the Virgin Atlantic restructuring story. And obviously the way that's being portrayed is that Virgin Atlantic they hope, secured a rescue deal. It happens to be using a particularly new, novel, court-based restructuring procedure, and figures of 1.2 billion have been just sort of banded around the media. Now, what I said to the journalist was, well, that's absolutely fine. So we know that there's some money coming in from an institution called Davis and Kempner, 170 million. Richard Branson, we're told, is putting in 200 million, and the balance up to
I think Paul was going to give us a... Yes, we can still hear you, but you're... Carry on.
Yeah, so the balance that's coming in is effectively creditor forbearance and delayed payments. Now, the point I made to the journalist was that you can have a plan where you've effectively agreed creditor forbearance and you've dealt with that, but what you actually need to do is look at the fundamental commercials going forward. So how are you going to deliver your plans? How are you going to get back to profitability? And how are you going to make sure that the hole that's been left behind is going to be plugged? And whether you're Virgin Atlantic or another airline, or whether or not you're a small supplier into the aviation sector for one of the sort of main manufacturers, whatever sort of business you are, you have to have a fundamental proposition going forward, and you have to be able to deliver that proposition. So for me, this is not the death of the airline. Oh. Sorry, you can hear me now, can you?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, apologies. The reason for this is that I'm actually in the middle of a very big, very complicated international restructuring, and I have calls coming in every 2 minutes disturbing my signal. So I do apologise for this. But yeah, what we need is a fundamental proposition going forward. And this is not to do with the death of the airline or the aviation sector at all. It's about what will the size and shape of it be in the future. You know, how large will the car parks around Gatwick need to be in order to, you know, make sure that there's enough room there to serve capacity without there being so much room that the car park operators are going to lose money. As Peter said, you know, airports are in many ways shopping centres with a transport hub attached to them. How are we going to make airports work? And all of the infrastructure and the supply chain around all of this, it has to be, to use a sort of rather inelegant phrase, it has to be right-sized for the future. And Peter's already used the term crystal ball as well. Nobody has one. So it's a very challenging situation that we face. We will get back to a degree of normality, but it will be, as people say, a new normal. And I think at that point I better stop, because I risk my signal dropping out again, and I'll hand back to you, Andrew.
Wonderful, thank you. Peter, would you like to respond to any of the points that...
There's an interesting point in terms of the airports, which is obviously different to the airlines. The airports have got significant amounts of sunk capital in infrastructure, buildings and cement and mortar, etc. And they are being seriously affected. So they've got to reduce their costs in the light of little revenue coming in, or not the revenue required. And the consequence of that, given the lower shortfall, is a significant reduction in personnel. So what's likely to come out of this, and it's beginning to happen, is significant losses of jobs at airports for at least 2 or 3 years, until such time as we get back to what people predict to be some level of normality in 2023. And even then, they're suggesting that perhaps the capacity will be 80% of what it was in 2019. So significant capital costs, which obviously they need to recover, and they can't, you know, once you've got a runway, you've got a runway. The airlines are in a slightly different position, in as much that, as I said earlier, they're able to significantly delay new orders of aircraft coming in, or accelerate those depending upon the cost efficiencies, and all aircraft come in are much more significantly cost effective than what they were, and obviously lay off all those old aeroplanes that are, you know, 4 engines or simply ineffective or inefficient. And the knock-on consequences for that is more felt perhaps with the banks and the lessors in terms of the people who own those aircraft, and the majority. So I think the ramifications in the hinterland, in the infrastructure supporting the airline industry, is probably more significant than the airlines themselves.
I guess when you look at some of the big restructurings in the market to do with landlords, some very famous shopping centre landlords, and where that lent itself, do you see any ripple effects onto the big regional owners of these airports? Because how do they survive without volume? If ultimately all their shopping centres are on turnover-based rents, and there's no turnover, okay, some of them will have certain retainers. There is absolutely no income coming in. There is massive corporate bank covenant issues. So do you see some of these regional airports either going through a restructuring or failing?
Well, certainly it's difficult for them to restructure. They've got a terminal, they've got a runway, they've got all the expense of running the airfield, and they can't turn the lights off. So the consequences is job losses, I'm afraid, quite significantly. But more important, or as importantly, is those airports that are owned by borough councils. Not all airports are owned by private investors. And I know Luton, for example, has a significant problem as a council in terms of shoring up the significant reductions that the airport has experienced and will continue to experience. So the impact of that will be presumably felt through the local taxpayer. So, you know, the tentacles are quite significant in terms of the impact it will have on society and the amount of cash that's available as a taxpayer and as a shareholder. So, yeah, these are significant, and they're not going to be quickly reimbursed. You're not going to recover this quick unless there is a significant change. I'll come back to my point earlier from the medical side, and that's obviously why probably billions are being spent on trying to find a vaccine as quickly as possible. That's really going to have a significant change, obviously, in what happens in the future. I think if that vaccine were available, and it was proven to be successful, then I think the V shape that everyone seems to talk about is likely to happen, subject to obviously disposable income has taken a knock as well, and therefore that may have an impact from an economist's point of view.
Perfect. Paul, can I bring you in? Oh, can I ask a quick question, Paul? So ultimately there are the ripple effects, the various suppliers into the industry, the multiple stages of suppliers. Your phone must be quite red hot at the moment. Local suppliers, regional suppliers, what are they doing as regards, how are they forecasting? Because if Peter's saying the airport and the airlines have trouble forecasting, the suppliers into the airport or into the airlines must have a devil of a job forecasting.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's not just that it's difficult for them to forecast. That's incredibly difficult for all businesses across the piece. And, you know, as restructuring professionals, we obviously have a certain toolkit that we can offer to people in terms of where they need to use some sort of formal procedure to facilitate their restructuring. Let's use the example of the CVA, the Creditors Voluntary Arrangement, which we're very familiar with because it's the procedure of choice for retailers at the moment when they wish to, do deals and re-gear their leases with landlords. Now, what we say to them is, well, of course, going forward, you need to be able to sort of provide a credible restructuring plan, but that credible restructuring plan is going to be based on a forecast. And at the moment, one of the really big problems we've got as restructuring professionals is actually getting those forecasts out of businesses and saying, well, you've given us a forecast, but explain to me why this is a meaningful, robust and useful forecast. So there's the very fundamental problem at the moment. Modeling a business at the moment is an incredibly difficult thing to do, whatever sort of business you are. Now, of course, if you are a supplier into the supply chain, the aviation supply chain, generally speaking, unless you're one of the absolute sort of monster suppliers, but if, there are a lot of small niche, almost sort of cottage industries, and I've dealt with some in the past, which are suppliers into the aviation industry, specialist parts manufacturers who special metallic treatments and coatings, for instance. These are not big businesses, and they are at the mercy of their customers, who are absolutely huge, and the terms and conditions by which you supply to them can actually be sort of quite unfavorable to you as a business as well. So that just exacerbates the problem. But what I just wanted to come back to quickly was actually the idea of airports, and in particular regional airports. I think there are sort of two things that we're here. I mean, this is the TMA. It's about turnaround, and it's about sort of, restructuring things. It's about sort of change. It's about redeploying assets into productive use, in a slightly different context. Well, there's two things. Cargo, number one, I think is something which is probably worth talking about for regional airports. Yet again, I'm going to have to ask you, am I still broadcasting loud and clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So cargo, obviously we all focus within the UK on our really sort of big airports, Heathrow being the largest by some margin within the UK, but we've got Gatwick, we've got Manchester, for the holiday market within the southeast, we've got Luton, for instance, we now have Southend, we could go on. But, a lot of the smaller regional airports, they operate for a lot of sort of cargo, air freight, and that is still actually a market which is pretty busy, sort of when we look at the aviation sector generally, I mean, cargo and air freight. The other thing is that these huge sort of land masses and land areas which are given over to airports, well, there is going to have to be rezoning, and there's going to have to be a change to their planning use, and there's going to have to be a sort of a government-driven legislative response which feeds down into the local planning framework to make sure that if you're not going to be able to operate an airport from that particular site anymore, you're going to have to do something different with it.
Paul, what's your feelings on how the banks are dealing with their customers who are in the supply chain? Is it more aggressive, less aggressive? Do they have specialized aviation guys, or is it just going into mainstream restructuring in the major banks?
Well, I mean, I tell you, the general pattern that we're seeing at the moment in terms of, I mean, let's just talk about the main sort of UK, clearing banks who lend into the business sector in the UK. I mean, obviously, when you look at the pattern across the world and the sort of, institutions whose names will be less familiar to us, it's a very different story, and I can come on to that. But certainly the mainstream banks in the UK are being incredibly forgiving at the moment. I mean, not in the aviation sector, but in a different context, where there was an event of default for a company that I've sort of been dealing with, and I've been working on the company side. I was told that one of their major lenders, that there was no prospect that they were going to enforce their security because they've effectively had a 3-line whip not to take aggressive action at the moment against borrowers. So I think there's certainly a cohort of bankers out there. There is undoubtedly, I've seen it, they are taking, and rightly so, of course, because we all need to sort of work together, whether it's the banking institutions, whether it's the lenders, whether it's the corporates themselves, the advisors, everybody is going to be part of the solution here. When it comes to sort of the, as I said, the international picture, I've seen a slightly different outlook. And it depends what country you're in. It depends, there are cultural dynamics to deal with, but in the sort of big restructuring I'm dealing with at the moment, which involves about 13 different lending institutions in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, some are being incredibly aggressive, but then they have sort of a bilateral situation where they've got specific security over some assets where they're very concerned about them. And they just want to try and recover their position. Others are being more conciliatory, where they perhaps they're part of a syndicate and they're looking at the bigger picture. So whether it's aviation or any other sector, I think it just depends on where you are. Certainly the UK banks, and if we've got a UK focus here, I think generally speaking, lenders are being quite pragmatic.
Peter, your history is as a robust chairman, MD, CEO of businesses. If you were advising an EasyJet, a Ryanair, what would you be saying on the boardroom now?
Well, I think that you have to distinguish between a short-haul carrier, EasyJet, Wizz, and a long-haul carrier. There's two entirely different ways in how they're going to recover. But on the short-haul market, it's a question of taking the opportunity to reset the dials. I think actually the what we call the ultra low cost, the Ryanair, the Wizzes, less so EasyJet, I think, have got considerable cash reserves. They've been quite shrewd in terms of how they've used their cash over many years. So I think obviously they've simply making sure that they continue with their cost initiatives. They're both and includes an EasyJet, exceptional in terms of keeping their costs under control. They're obviously reducing staff, and they've kept aircraft on the ground, and the way in which they buy their aircraft and they lease their aircraft are quite clever. So their balance sheets are quite strong. It's a question of how quickly can they get back into the air, and obviously make sure that their revenue management side is effective. But I would also importantly take this opportunity to look at other initiatives. As what I said earlier about resetting the dials. Is this an opportunity to accelerate the green technology, which is important from an environmental perspective? It's important increasingly from a consumer's perspective. And obviously from the OEMs, the Airbus and the Boeings, it's becoming quite a prolific topic in terms of how efficient can we generate aircraft in the future, because inevitably there's always going to be a market for people to fly around the world. It's a question of the size and shape of that going in the future. So I'd be looking at what additional initiatives can we consider. But equally, what does the balance sheet look like in 2 or 3 years' time? I've had many experiences where I've followed some big name consultants into organizations who've generated fantastic, very expensive, beautiful, the banks love them, recovery plans that last between 3 or 5 years. And I annoyingly sort of pick my nose and say, but what happens in the 6th year? And then suddenly you find actually they haven't generated sufficient working capital to create any sense of longevity other than simply get through their short-term requirements. So I think I would be advising the board to consider concentrate your mainline staff on survival, creating liquidity, but the CEO and other C-level people be involved in making sure that we've got a future beyond 2 or 3 years. So that's really where we talk about a second wave in terms of coronavirus, and I hope from a human perspective that doesn't happen. But I think what might happen is a second or third wave of further financial failures within the airlines, because they won't look up and consider what happens in the future, as opposed to quite understandably, absolutely understandably, looking at their navel and not concentrating on the long-term knitting game.
For our participants, there is an ability to type in a question on the Q&A. So I'll use some of those questions during the next 20 minutes. Just a quick question. Following on from that, Peter, there's a person who has asked a question about, will the environment and the environmental issues stop or help the recovery of the airline? Because there's been a huge, when airlines were theoretically doing well, making money, it's a nice problem to have, to say, well, therefore, how do we make it better for the environment, because we're making a lot of money? If you're not making any money, you're losing the staff, your fundamentals are going through the floor. And how do you still keep an eye on the environmental side? Because that may be a less efficient way of running your airline or your business. There's going to be a balancing act here.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to say the airline industry is not particularly good at promoting itself in terms of the environmental. We generate 2% of the CO2 globally. So that needs to be put into perspective. But what I can tell you is airlines, the authorities, governments, ICAO, IATA, and certainly the engine manufacturers and the principal airframe manufacturers have really been concentrating in the last few years to make sure we can make aircraft more efficient. And indeed, aircraft like the 350, the 787, which are capable of carrying a lot of people long distances at far more effective environmental impact than the 747s or the 380s or the old 346s. So there has been significant, and that will continue. What I'm saying is that perhaps we can accelerate that, look at technology, and perhaps try and offset some of the reductions in job losses that we will see, not just in this country, but clearly globally, as a significant reduction of people traveling through airports, and try and re-divert that talent, capability through government investment or private investment into green technology relating to the aviation industry. So I think I come out of this, to be a CEO, you have to be an optimist, otherwise don't do it. So therefore I'm looking and seeking continually for opportunities in terms, we are where we are. We have to manage today, but equally we can't just manage today at the expense of tomorrow. So I think it's a valid question, and I would certainly be looking at other opportunities moving forward.
Paul, I cut across you earlier. You were about to say something.
It's not quite as bad in terms of the environmental opportunities as one might think. Sorry.
Paul, I cut across you earlier. You were about to say something.
Yeah, I'll pick up a couple of points. I mean, number one, I absolutely agree with Peter that the PR around the airline industry's contribution to climate change is appalling. Because as Peter rightly said, the global aviation and airline sector, or no, the airline sector, aircraft in the sky contributes 2% of the world's CO2 production. What we actually should be worried about is, huge polluting factories pumping CO2 out into the atmosphere, and massive livestock factory type farm businesses where the cows are pumping huge amounts of methane into the air, etc. That's a much bigger problem. But of course, the airline industry is a hugely visible one. People, wrongly, but nonetheless, people look up into the sky and they see an aircraft and they see the contrail behind it. And the reason it's called a contrail is because it means condensation. That is just literally water vapor you're seeing. But of course, you know, people who don't know these things and don't understand the physics of it probably think that in some way that is an indicator of the carbon dioxide being pumped out the back of the aircraft. It's not. The airline industry, and particularly the engine manufacturers and also the main manufacturers, have done more to contribute to efficiency gains in the transport sector than probably any other sector, and I include in that the car industry. Although of course we do have a more mature electric car industry, but the efficiency of an engine on a Boeing 787 or an Airbus A350, compared to what the equivalent was 30 years ago, it's not immeasurably, but it's hugely improved. So that's one thing. And of course, we do actually already have sort of relatively nascent technology where there are now single engine electric aircraft, which are prototypes, but nonetheless, they have flown. EasyJet certainly has committed to having an all-electric passenger aircraft flying by, I can't remember what particular date, and it will be short haul. But it's the short haul I want to then come on to. So like any business, you obviously, we have fixed costs, we have variable costs. And actually, for the short haul carriers, who are the ones who are probably going to bounce back the quickest, their ability to change or to shrink not their route network, but the frequency with which they fly that route network, that's pretty dynamic. So if you look at British Airways, I mean, I'm sitting down in the southwest of France at the moment. British Airways fly down to Toulouse. Typically, they fly down there 4 or 5 times a day, 6 days a week. At the moment, British Airways are flying to Toulouse once a day, which is actually sort of quite annoying for me because I need to sort of move backwards and forwards a bit. But an airline can do that. It can basically say, right, we're just going to basically take out. And now they can also adjust their variable costs quite easily, because it means that you don't need all of the crew. It means you don't need the air crew. It means you don't need the cabin crew. It means you don't need the fuel. You don't need the ground handling and all the maintenance. So actually, for short haul carriers, they should be able to quite dynamically change their cost base, not their fixed cost base in the same way. Obviously, that's a much harder thing to change. But they can actually, just by not flying aircraft, they can have a major sort of impact on their overall profitability as they rebuild. So it's the short haul carriers, I think, which are going to come back quicker. And demand for short haul is coming back quicker as well. I mean, undoubtedly. I mean, we were discussing the other day, our collective experiences are that people who have flown on short haul routes, the planes have been quite full. Well, they will be. Because if, as I said, British Airways is only flying once a day to Toulouse, and they're flying it on an A320 or A319 with 140 odd passengers, they will fill that up with one flight a day. They're not going to do that 5 times a day at the moment, but they'll do it once a day.
Peter, there's an interesting question, which is a technical question. Will pilots, when they come back, need compulsory training to get them back into the flow? And is there enough capacity in the training systems to allow that? So are we going to have a constraint on the ability to have airlines getting their flights in the air and bums on seats?
Oh, there clearly are technical requirements for pilots to be what we call current. And they can achieve that by simulator time. There's certainly a lot of capacity in terms of simulators, and they've been busy. And the great thing about simulators is they can be used 24/7. So huge amounts of pilots have gone through and continued their currency to make sure that when they do return to fly, they can fly safely. Added to which, I know a number of airlines have had aircraft in the sky specifically to make sure that pilots have what we call line experience. So I feel, as a pilot myself, very confident that the safety requirements, which is obviously our paramount purpose, we don't want to hurt anyone, is undertaken correctly. So yes, they are totally competent and continue to train.
But actually,
there's another.
Sorry, Andrew, I was just going to add something to that, because there's an interesting sort of little sort of segue. We all heard this, obviously we're all very familiar with the story of the 737 MAX, which is the next generation of the Boeing 737, currently grounded, and we're familiar with all of that. One of the issues, when the 737 MAX came in, it was actually a very different aircraft from previous generations of Boeing 737. And yet the way in which Boeing had portrayed it was that, no, it's just a better, it's the newer version. And actually there were, I understand, very few Boeing 737 MAX simulators around the world. So pilots weren't actually able to get any simulator time on that particular configuration of that particular aircraft. And that was actually one of the problems that they have. So, you know, simulator time is obviously sort of the way in which pilots can stay current without having to do the more expensive thing, which is actually put an aircraft up in the air. But, you know, when we are sort of focusing on newer generations of aircraft as they come through, and obviously the sort of the big stories at the moment are the NEOs, the A350, the 787 and the 737 MAX, you do have to have enough simulator capacity for all of the pilots to basically get their type ratings on those particular aircraft. I'm not sure to what extent that's a problem with the 787, the A350, etc. But certainly with the MAX, it was a problem.
Peter, most of our participants are advisors. If you were back in the old seat of being a CEO of an airline or an ancillary airline business supplier, what would you be looking for as an advisor comes through the door? What would you reject the advisor as a general purpose guy? And what would you accept? Wow, this guy can really help me. What are the key constituents you'd be looking for from our members to try and assist you if you were being asked, if either the bank imposed an advisor on you, or you or your shareholders or stakeholders wanting, or you actually needed assistance? What would you be looking for advisors? How would you rate them?
I think it's the long-term, the longevity and the sustainability. I'd want specific advice, financial, technical, from the point of view of structure, in terms of, you know, if I get through this problem, and you know, if they're not spending their time doing that, then they're going to go out of business. So I assume that's what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's a danger. I repeat what I said earlier of ignoring the future. So therefore, I've been asking my advisors specifically to look at how they see the future, what opportunities and alternatives. At AMG, we have developed a model which allows us to take in a number of different considerations in terms of how we see life developing from an airline perspective, and we've applied those in terms of trying to give some indication. And certainly the base level is an assumption that you will survive the current downturn. That survival is going further out as we progress, because of the lack of optimism in terms of how quickly can we return to normal, if we ever do that. So therefore one has to look. So that's the advice that, and we provided some input as AMG to some airlines in terms of how we see that developing over the short term. But if I was a CEO of an airline, then that's the sort of advice I'll be looking. Help me restructure and make sure intellectually that I am able to grow into a company that can sustain. Now, it comes back significantly to my point I made earlier, and that is, if you have all the advice in the world, and I've used all of them, and believe me, I've used all of them at great expense, either because I've been told to or I wanted to. If I haven't got the management team that's capable of taking that advice, then implement. They won't implement, they recommend and suggest. very few, unlike us at AMG, we do actually implement, and that's the key difference. Then have I got the management team that's capable of making this quite significant transition? This is not just adjusting for a hiccup in the marketplace or a hiccup on the stock exchange or whatever. This is profound. This is significant. So I need to have a management team that makes sure that I can carry on managing my company more effectively than I've had in the past if I've come from a bad situation. If I come from a bad situation, then perhaps I shouldn't be in my job anyway. Yeah. But I think that's what I'll be. So it's about structure, it's about organization, it's about capability, and it's about making sure that financially I've got a sensible, robust future and I'm not mortgaging my life away.
Paul, when you're pitching for aviation specialist work, what's the number one thing you're seeing the client wants from you on that?
A number of different things, but I suppose number one is that the client wants to know that you're absolutely on their side, that you understand their issues, and that you are going to have some novel solutions. What they don't want is you to tell them what they already know. And I think at Quantuma, one of the things that we really focus on is actually establishing those sort of close relationships with the client and being prepared to make bold statements and be robust with them and actually challenge them. And, you know, I'll use an example of a call I was on sort of quite late into last night where, you know, the client is in very significant difficulty and it's a very, very large business. And it's easy to get blinded by sort of telephone numbers when you're talking about turnovers in the billions, when you're talking about assets in the billions, when you're talking about lending in the hundreds of millions, totaling the billions. And, you know, you could almost become intimidated by the size and scale of it. But I always say to myself, and, you know, my colleagues, we all say to ourselves at Quantuma, well, the fundamentals of business are kind of the same, whether or not you're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar international complex enterprise or whether you're dealing with a smaller business. And as professionals, you know, and you know, the fundamentals are the same. It's a profit and loss account. It's a balance sheet. It's a cash flow statement. It's sticking to the fundamentals and actually being able to say to the management team, let's get to the core of the problem, and then we will use skills and experience we have as technical professionals in restructuring, insolvency, finance, etc., to actually work with you to find a solution. That's what people want.
I think I've learned in my life that it's the last 5 years, it's all about being that ringmaster, the honest broker as well, because most of these large deals are full of professionals all advising. But as Peter says, what you really want is the advisor who actually wants to lead and then come up with a practical solution delivery. So finding that crossover person who understands enough about the insolvency restructuring, understands enough about law and accounting, but can also take a leadership role, not because he's got the big brand or he has a vision of, it can actually help people deliver a solution. I think that's a very positive thing. Can I just ask one question of Peter before we wrap up? Yeah. You were a member of IATA. What's IATA thinking behind the scenes now? What if you were in a pub with one of your old members, with one of your colleagues, what would they be talking about? What's their big issue at the moment? How it affects them?
Well, obviously the state of the industry and how we're going to cover. How can we get more people back in the air? There's a lot of government communication in terms of making sure that we can carry people safely. That's our prime responsibility, from a safety point of view, simply in flying, and making sure that the regulations and the flow of passengers is in a satisfactory way. But clearly, trying to work with governments, universities to make sure that we are creating a safe environment for people to fly. That requires a vaccine, that requires confidence in the marketplace, and at the end of the day, it's about confidence. And IATA's role in that, representing all the significant airlines in the world, is a pot of expertise that's developing and working on various options that the airline industry as a whole can apply to the marketplace. So they're very focused at the present moment, and obviously equally trying to understand the modelling situation, what it will mean to the members, in terms of the economics as we as we move forward. Can I just make a couple of points that Paul just referred to? I worked for DHL. I was on the main board, and I ran the Americas. I had 108 countries reporting to me, and so big turnovers. But countries like Paraguay and Bolivia and Antigua and Barbuda all had country managers under DHL. And I felt, having run very large organizations in large countries, that they had a more difficult time than I did. If you're turning over $1 million and you make a $5 mistake, it's quite significant. So I understand the complexity in terms of larger countries, but I think that smaller companies, and here's the rub, they can't afford to have advisors and expensive guys and people coming along saying you should do this and you should do that. So I think there's an awful lot of assistance that TMA and others, including myself, can provide these smaller organisations some assistance and some guidance, even free of charge. And that's where, as AMG, we like to take skin in the game. So there's no point making advice and recommendations and helping implement if we don't take an upside of that. In other words, we're not risk adverse in terms of helping. I think there should be a generation now of people coming together, not just seeking to make money. That's obviously what's going to happen, but also there must be a philanthropic perhaps situation where those smaller organisations can be given some free advice and some counsel.
Okay, I'd like to ask one more question, and then I'd like then to ask our two speakers to give a minute wrap up their key takeaways, and then we'll finish this, because we've only lost about 15, 20 people out of all the participants that have been on. So someone actually likes it out there, so I'm relieved. Interesting question, state aid. European countries seem to be more positive, more giving than the UK. Do you see a difference in the UK version of help versus a European version of help? Probably Peter first, then Paul.
Yeah, well, I have a very specific view on that. I was CEO of Air Malta, and we had to seek approval. It took 18 months to get state aid to allow Air Malta to restructure. And we did, and it became profitable at that stage. I thought that was totally justified. However, we had to prove to the EU, and it was probably the toughest business plan I've ever had to present, to prove that the longevity, once having taken 240 million euros worth of state aid, could be fixed. The key for me, therefore, is state aid is fine, but providing you make sure you invest in those airlines that, as a result of that state aid, are going to survive afterwards, and not simply use that money as a stopgap to keep them going. If they were bad before COVID-19, what is going to make those changes? That's what I want to see in the business plan. Almost certainly a change in management as they move forward. In that respect, I support state aid. Without that, I don't.
Right. Okay, we'll wrap up now. Paul, do you want a quick 1 minute on just a final thought process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really the message from me, and I'd like to pick up on something that Peter just said, actually, because I don't think it's something that necessarily does get particularly well broadcast or discussed. And I'm involved in an initiative at the moment, and we're trying to sort of get the Treasury to buy into it, and various other sort of departments within government. And that is that, specialists like Airline Management Group, who are operational, and organisations like the TMA, and organisations like Quantuma, where we're corporate finance, restructuring, accountancy specialists, we've all got collectively a really important role to play in the rebuild, I suppose, of UK PLC and beyond. In fact, you could say in some respects now is our time. We don't sit there like vultures hoping to pick off the bones. We genuinely, and certainly within Quantuma as a business, we genuinely want to contribute to, as we can, to helping the UK rebuild its economy. And Peter made the point that, we will on occasions do things for free. Absolutely. That's one of the really critical messages that people need to understand. Picking up the phone to a partner at Quantuma, or to Peter at Airline Management Group, or to, one of our, TMA members here, picking up the phone to actually say, this is my problem. I'm a small business owner, or I've got a big business or whatever, and I don't know where to turn at the moment, and I just need some advice. That is what we collectively are all brilliant at, I think. And that's what we should be used for. And that's sort of a message I think I want to leave people with, that it's really important we are all seen to be part of a solution, and that we don't just stick the clock on and start charging people from the minute we open our mouths.
Peter, final minute.
Bertrand Russell once said that conventional people are roused to fury by departure from convention, largely see they see such departure as a criticism of themselves. Today, in the airline industry, in any industry, you've got to break convention. You've got to think outside the box. Otherwise, you're not going to survive. For me, this is a golden opportunity. If you can overcome your short-term liquidity, be ruthless, make sure you keep your eye on the future, look above the parapet, make changes, whatever changes are necessary. There's great opportunities in the future. Break convention.
Thank you, Peter. Just a bit of a quick word from me. The TMA is a broad umbrella business, everything from agents to IPs to bankers, solicitors, advisors, consultants. We don't push one particular angle. We believe that we can offer all angles on a particular issue, and we can come at it from multiple different ways. So I would urge you to look at our website. If you are a member, use it. Basically, there's so much going on. If you're not a member, it's a very cost-effective way of joining. We are the biggest trade body, restructuring turnaround body in the world. We've got over 9,000 members. If you look at our page of our sponsors, there are a huge amount of big names there, which have a valid reason for being members, and we have been growing our business for a long time. If you look at our events, you'll see a whole list of new events going forward in the next 6 months. So I'd urge you to dial in and join. I think all it remains for me to say is thank you, Peter and Paul. Thank you for our sponsor, Guantama, and thank you very much. We've wrapped it up with 10:33. We're losing participants now, but it would, during the day we had only about 15 people drop off from the guys that actually turned up. So I was very encouraged with that. Thank you very much, and cheerio. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.